So this adorable little subwoofer is the KEF KC62. Of course, most of you watching this right now are already aware of that, not just due to the title of my video, but also because this happens to be one of the most popular subwoofers on the market today, which means just about everybody and their mother has already reviewed it. And even though that makes me late to the game, you know what? That's not going to stop me from giving you all my take on this little sub. And I think the best way to kick off this evaluation is to first make it clear as to who the KC62 is geared towards. In a nutshell, it's for the audio enthusiast who wants clean yet powerful bass output from something that's not a big box. It's basically for people who just either don't have enough room to accommodate a big subwoofer, or it's for somebody who just doesn't want to see a big subwoofer in their living space, yet you still want that high quality boom boom. Now to be clear, micro subwoofers are nothing new. In fact, they've been manufactured for many decades now. Yet when KEF released the KC62, it caused quite a bit of a stir in the audiophile community, mostly due to the claims that KEF made about this little tiny subwoofer. Claims such as its ability to extend all the way down to 11 hertz, which is impressive even for a big subwoofer. They also claim that it will deliver 105 dB of bass output, which is eviction notice level amounts of output. And then on top of that, they said it can do all of this while maintaining exceptional sound quality with the ability to pair up to a wide variety of speakers beyond just what they have in their own portfolio. So basically, KEF was making this sound like the perfect holy grail. And the big question is, well, is it? Well, let me get to that in just a moment. Now, before I do, I know that this is a very high-tech subwoofer, and I just don't feel like spending a whole lot of time going over the tech because it's been covered to death by now. If you're really interested in the details, just click on the description box below and follow the white paper and get your read on. But yeah, it's cool stuff. I mean, the drivers, of course, are custom made for this. They feature this nice magnesium cone material, a very flexible surround, an extruded aluminum case, 1,000 watts of power, DSP for days that monitors the behavior of the subwoofer. I mean, it's really trippy stuff. But again, there's no need to go into detail. Plenty of reviewers have already done that. The last thing that I need to mention here is that all of this tech doesn't come cheap, right? I mean, this sub retails for $1,500 each, and that brings up two questions. Is this sub worth it, and does it live up to the big claims that KEF made for it? Well, it's time to give you all my take on that. Actually, before I move on, I want to briefly show you what the black KC62 looks like next to the white KC62. KEF ended up sending me two subs of two completely different colors, and while I have kind of a Shamu situation going on, this nonetheless gives me the opportunity to show you all what they look like side by side. So here you are, and now that we have a pretty good idea as to what they look like, now it's time to talk about how they actually sound. Okay, so when it comes to performance, let's go ahead and get the big question out of the way first, which is the KC62 the real deal, or is it just a little bit overhyped? Well, in my experience, the answer is it just depends on how you plan on using this sub. So here's what I mean. On one hand, the KC62 offers the best all-around performance that I've experienced from a micro sub. And when it comes to sound quality, it's really good. It's almost as if REL and SVS had a baby and the little KC62 is the result. Pretty awesome stuff. And yet, on the other hand, will the KC62 always sound like a much bigger subwoofer, let alone one you could buy for the same amount of money? And the answer to that question is sometimes yeah, but for the most part no. And this is what it really boils down to, your listening habits. If you're somebody who listens mostly at moderate listening volumes of around, say, 85 dB or less, then you know what? Yeah, the KC62 really is everything that KEF made it out to be. This little subwoofer that sounds much bigger than what it is, something that will give you true subsonic extension in room, all the while giving you exceptional sound quality. Under this circumstance, you really can't have your cake and eat it too. However, once you start cranking the volume beyond that point, and especially as you start digging into the 90 dB range, well, that's when some obvious compromises are going to begin setting in. And really, this is what you should expect from something that's so small that is actually tinier than most compact two-way monitors. And to really hammer home what the subwoofer is all about, well, now it's time to dive into some details. So I'm not sure about you all, but whenever I evaluate a subwoofer, I'm basically looking at three parameters: bass quality, extension, and overall output. So let's start off by discussing the bass quality of the KC62. Now, I admit that when I got it in, I didn't know what to expect because it seems like KEF's marketing was really focusing on the numbers, 11 hertz extension and 105 dB output, and it made it seem like their main priority here was to give you a lot of loudness from this little box, but not a whole lot of fidelity. And as it turns out, that's not true at all. In fact, the fidelity of the KC62, the overall bass quality is exceptional, practically nipping at the heels of REL in this regard, all the while giving you strong output. So, when it comes to bass quality, the first thing that I look at is how well can it integrate with a wide variety of speakers, and how difficult is it to make that happen. And with the KC62, it's actually pretty easy. The first thing I would encourage everyone to do is to use those EQ presets on the back. They work, they're not a gimmick, and once you do that, the rest of the integration process is pretty simple. And what I was impressed with was how well the KC62 blended with a huge variety of speakers, to include speakers that, quite frankly, are notoriously difficult to work with when it comes to integrating a subwoofer. Speakers like my Harbeth P3 ESRs, a sealed design, or the KLH Model 5, an acoustic suspension design, or even the Klipsch Forte 4s. It sounded great with all of those speakers, just as it sounded great with, of course, the KEF LS50 Meta and even the Dyne Audio Confidence 20s. So when it comes to integration, this subwoofer is fantastic. Now, the next thing that I look for is clarity or note definition. How easy is it to pick apart all the details in the bass, particularly at the crossover point and the upper bass range? And with the KC62, it's super easy, and it doesn't sound flustered even with complex music, like, say, metal or classical, which is where you can really trip up some lesser subwoofers. But unless you really start to crank the volume, nope, the KC62 maintains its composure, and it's very easy to pick out all of the details. And that leads me to the last parameter that I look at, which is tone and texture. Okay, it may have good clarity, but does it actually sound like a real instrument with what few instruments actually dig that low? And the answer is yes, it's very good in that regard, but this is where REL actually has the advantage. I think REL has a lighter tonal quality at the crossover point. This is where you will also find just a little bit better tone and texture with REL subs versus what you get out of the KC62. The KC62 is really close, but it's not quite there with REL. But there is a trade-off here, because while REL is going to give you a lighter sound, the KC62 is going to give you a fuller and more muscular and ballsy sound in that range. So in many respects, it's just more a matter of what you want. But overall, the quality is great, and it sounds great with a huge variety of music. And of course, when it comes to electronic and dance and hip hop, it's a blast to listen to, but it's also a lot of fun and sounds very natural with classical music and jazz and rock and things like that. So quality, no problems. Now it's time to talk about extension. So the big question is, can it really give you 11 hertz of frequency extension in room? Well, a lot of people have confirmed that it can. Now, I admit that in my experience, I didn't have any luck there. I ran an 11 hertz test tone, and the woofers weren't really moving all too much. There was no pressurization going on in room, so I wasn't so lucky in that regard. However, once I played a 15 hertz test tone, that's when things changed. Those woofers were dancing around. Oh my God, the room just filled with pressure. I heard things rattling in other parts of the house. I mean, it's just crazy that this little tiny sub with two 6.5-inch woofers was pulling off that trick and doing it cleanly. I mean, it just wasn't even struggling at all. So yeah, the extension is really good. Now, are you always going to get subsonic extension out of this sub? Well, as you crank the volume, the answer is no. And that leads me to its overall output. So, as I said not too long ago, when you listen at moderate volumes, this subwoofer actually sounds bigger than what it is. I think in a blind test, a lot of people would struggle to pick out the little KC62 next to something that, say, uses a 12-inch woofer. However, once you start to increase the volume, yes, the KC62 will get freakishly loud, but frequency extension is going to become compromised, and as you crank the volume, the KC62 begins to sound more like the small subwoofer that it really is. And this is basically what's going on. The DSP is monitoring the behavior of the drivers and everything inside of the subwoofer, and it's basically saying, hey, I noticed that you're trying to listen at very loud volumes. I can do that for you, But these little woofers are moving and they're working really hard to give you that sound pressure level. So I'm going to have to sacrifice extension, because if I don't, everything's going to begin distorting and that's going to lead to damage. So as a safety protocol, I'm not going to let that happen, but you are going to get your volume output. But there are going to be compromises. You're not going to get that extension, and some of the quality is also going to be compromised, especially as you go into the 90 dB territory. So clearly this isn't going to be for somebody who wants that super visceral impact, right? You want to feel like you're practically getting a colonoscopy from all of the bass output. I mean, this subwoofer is really good for what it is, but no, it's not going to give you that pretty much at any volume. But overall, I would say that this subwoofer is the real deal when it comes to all-around performance. Clearly, it's not going to be for everybody. It's going to be mostly for somebody who's limited on space and or you don't want a big box in your room. But if you can afford it, it's a pretty good way to go. Do I have complaints? Well, sure. I wish that KEF had an app like SVS does, because let me tell you, having an app that you can just download and make all the adjustments from the convenience of your phone is great. You don't have to get up and keep moving things around. And the next complaint I would have isn't really a complaint, it's more just an observation that all of this performance and build quality doesn't come cheap. $1,500, right? That's not something that everybody can afford. So I'm hoping there will be some trickle-down tech as time goes on to make performance like this a little bit more accessible to the average person. But that said, I do think you do get what you pay for, and there's nothing else quite like it in the market right now. And that is going to lead me to some tips for those of you who are seriously considering this sub and you want to know what you can do to really maximize the performance out of it. Then I'll go over some comparisons, and then I'm going to wrap this whole thing up. So let's go. So you know what? I just realized that I don't really have a whole lot to say here. And that's because the KC62 is so easy to work with. Still, there are at least a couple things worth mentioning. And the first is to reinforce what I said earlier, which is the importance of using those EQ presets. Look, I'm not saying that you have to, but it really does help with the integration process. And it doesn't really matter whether or not you have the sub out into the room or against a wall, or you have it corner loaded or inside of a cabinet, or you're using it in an apartment. There are presets for each of those configurations, and in my experience, they work. And besides, if you're paying for it, you might as well try it out. And then lastly, usually with most subwoofers, I recommend for people to place them on a solid foundation like a marble slab or a very thick cutting board, because usually this helps to tighten up the bass a little bit. But with the KC62, when I tried that out, I didn't notice a huge improvement in overall sound quality. And I think that's because what we're dealing with is this ultra tiny, super dense compact sub that doesn't really need any help in that regard. Still, it's something that's worth trying to see if it benefits you in your configuration. And no, I didn't listen to this sub on the speaker stand, so if you want to try that out, go for it. Let me know how you like it. But in my experience, just leaving it on the floor as is should be good enough for you. Anyway, now that we're done with this embarrassingly short section, let's move on and go over some comparisons. Okay, so for this section, I'm going to address a couple questions that I've seen from you all as it relates to the KC62 and its main competitors. So one of the most common questions I've seen come from people who can afford a KC62, but they're not sure whether or not to spend their money on the little KEF sub or to put the same amount of money towards something else, like say 2 REL T7Is. Now I think this is a wonderful question, and this is going to be my take on the situation. Now actually, before I begin, I need to point out that even though the REL T7I is a compact subwoofer, it's much larger than the little KEF. And yet despite that, that little KEF will do things that both of those RELs cannot. For example, it will give you better frequency response, it'll dig a lot deeper than both of those RELs, and it will actually output more bass than both of those RELs. It will also give you a fuller, more muscular sound at the crossover point. So what does that mean? Well, it means it really just depends on what kind of media it is that you listen to. If you're a bass head and or you listen to a lot of dance, pop, electronic, or hip-hop music, or you do video games and movies, then the KEF is likely going to be the better option for you. And bear in mind, the sound quality on that sub is really good, practically as good as a REL. So that begs the question then who would buy the REL setup? Well, quite a few people. If you don't really listen to that kind of music often and you're somebody who's fanatical about bass quality, Well, the two Rel T7Is are going to be the better way to go, because when you're getting two really good subwoofers that will better evenly distribute bass out into the room, that will help you with integration. The sound of the Rel subwoofers is going to be a little lighter, a little quicker right at the crossover point, and the tone and texture is going to be a little bit better. So if you don't listen to that kind of music and you just want a little bit more bass than what your main speakers can provide, Rel is going to be the better way to go. Either way, you're going to be getting a great listening experience, but that is basically how it breaks down in my experience. And then next, let's move on and talk about another competitor, which is the recent SVS Micro 3000, their own little micro sub. Now, despite it being a micro sub, it is still substantially larger than the KC62. And the question is, how close is it in performance to the little KEF sub? And in my experience, the answer is, well, it's somewhat there, but no, there's a pretty big gap in performance. I mean, first, the build quality on the KEF is on another planet. The KEF will extend much lower than the SVS, and its quality of bass is notably better than what you get with the SVS Micro 3000. It's not to say that the Micro 3000 is bad. It's actually a really good value. But the only real advantage it has outside of price is that it will output more volume than the KEF, because it is a larger subwoofer with larger drivers. And it will sound like a larger subwoofer at those higher volumes. But make no mistake, it's not really a KC62. And before I wrap up this section, I want to once again emphasize something I said earlier, which is when you listen to the KC62, it really does sound like amalgamation between Rel and SVS. You get quality that's practically on par with Rel, but you also get some of that muscular sound that you would associate with SVS. And I think that's a middle ground that a lot of people would actually enjoy. And it would explain why a lot of reviewers like myself really ended up liking the KC62 in a way that we thought we wouldn't. And this is actually the perfect segue to my final and personal thoughts about this subwoofer. So let's go. Okay, so now that the bulk of this review is over, it's time for me to wrap up this video by laying down my own subjective thoughts regarding the KC62. So it's interesting because there's nothing else quite like this subwoofer on the market today. Nothing else that's as small, as well made, featuring the same level of tech with the same level of all-around performance. And I say this having owned many other different micro subwoofers. As I may have mentioned earlier on, I've had micro subs from Sunfire, Velodyne, Rel, Polk Audio, and a couple others that I can't remember. And each and every time I ran into the same compromises. You either got a lot of output at the expense of fidelity, or you got really good fidelity at the expense of output. And the KC62 is the first micro subwoofer that I've come across that really does such a convincing job of giving you a taste of everything. And yet despite that, even though KEF hasn't really redefined physics for us, they've more pushed the envelope as to what's possible for a compact sub, despite that, there are still going to be a number of people who look at this and they're just not going to get it, because all they're going to see is the $1,500 price tag, two 6.5-inch woofers, and they're automatically going to write this off as a ripoff. And you know what? For some people, it's not going to be a good value. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, this little subwoofer is for somebody who wants a taste of a big sounding subwoofer, but from something that's compact. Maybe it's because you can't physically accommodate a big subwoofer in your room, or maybe it's because you just straight up don't want to see a big subwoofer in your room. And if that's you, I think the KC62 is the best option on the market today. However, for those of you who are not very limited to how big of a subwoofer you can have, and you can go with something larger, and if your priority when you're spending that kind of money is to get that visceral bass that again makes it feel like you're having a colonoscopy when you're really cranking things, then yeah, the KC62 is not going to be the best option for you. But then again, it was never designed for you to begin with. And that's the beauty of choice. There's so many options out there that there's pretty much something for everyone. And that, of course, leads me to my own personal reaction to the sub. And what can I say? It's fun. And I don't mind revealing that I spoke to a number of different reviewers right before they received their KC62s. And I don't mind admitting that a number of us were pretty skeptical. I mean, we're very interested in this sub, but we're very skeptical of KEF's claims. And a lot of us were just waiting to, I wouldn't say roast this sub, but to go before you all and to say, it's okay, your money could be better spent elsewhere, because we're hyper aware of how many people out there are just hungry for negative and or, neutral-ish type reviews. And yet every single one of us, after we received it, we were like, wow, you know what? It's not perfect. It's not for everyone, but this sub is the real deal. It's really good. It combines great quality with great extension, great output for its size, and it's just a whole lot of fun. I know I had a lot of fun listening to it in both my main stereo system and especially in my desktop rig. I mean, I could live with this sub, period, in my desktop system. And really, when it comes to fun, that's what this is all about. And I think that's where the KC62 really shines. It's that right mix between quality and quantity. You do have to pay for it, but if you can afford it, I don't think you're going to regret it. Anyway, that is going to be my take on this little subwoofer. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace. Okay, so this bonus section is here to cover two topics that I forgot to mention in the main body of my review. The first is, what happens when you use two KC62s? Well, the answer is, as with just about any subwoofer, you basically get more of the same but better. So the first advantage is, of course, you can better evenly fill a room with bass. This is going to help you with integrating your subs with your speakers just a little bit easier and more seamlessly. And then, of course, you're going to get more output, about 30 to 40% more raw bass output, as well as just a little bit more extension in room, because now you have two subs working instead of just one trying to fill in that space. So if you can afford it, and clearly that's a lot of money, we're talking about $3,000 at this point, I would encourage you to do it. Because once you get used to the sound of two subwoofers that are calibrated in room, it's really hard to go back to listening to just one subwoofer. Unless, of course, you're using it for a desktop environment. And that leads me to the second thing, which is, how does the KC62 perform for desktop setups? Well, to me, the answer is it's pretty much God tier, because here you're dealing with this compact sub that can really get out of the way in these cramped spaces, so you don't have to worry about your feet constantly clanging against it. You have EQ presets, which will help it to sound better in these cramped environments. And then when it comes to overall bass performance, I mean, it's amazing. With games, with movies, with different types of music, it integrates well with a huge variety of speakers. I mean, if you can afford it, definitely do it. Do you need two subs in that environment? Heck no. But I will never turn somebody away from just going complete overkill on a stereo system. So that is going to be it for those two topics. So for real this time, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.